Welcome all to the first in our coffee morning series for Data Saves Lives, where we discuss hot topics over hot drinks. With us today are expert representatives of 3 important projects, all coordinated by the multi-stakeholder Innovative Medicines Initiative, IMI, that share common goals to standardise and make health data accessible. The Eden project, where we've got Nige representing, HTO represented by Melly, and Pioneer with Sarah. If you haven't seen the overviews of these projects on the Data Saves Lives YouTube channel, then you might find them helpful for context for today's discussion on how patient groups have benefited from leading or collaborating on health data initiatives. They're on our page and just a few minutes each, so please do check them out.
Thanks for organizing this. My name is Menis Styliadou. I work in the Data Science Institute of Takeda, and I am the industry lead for the H2O project. And I would love to talk to you more about it.
Hello, hi, I'm Nigel Hughes. I'm a scientific director in epidemiology in global research and development at Janssen, and I'm what's called the project lead or the industry lead for the European Health Data and Evidence Network, Eden.
Hello, I'm Sarah and I work for the European Association of Urology, and we're a medical professional organisation, and we lead the academic consortia of Pioneer, Prostate Pioneer. It's a big data for better prostate cancer outcomes project.
So thank you all for joining us today. We have our first question, which we're putting out to many of you. Happy to kick us off, which is, what are the benefits of standardising data collection methods and increasing accessibility to data by patient?
The most important thing is that by standardizing patient outcomes, one will be able to compare among apples with apples and pears with pears. It's as simple as that. So we have currently so much outcome sets around the globe, but they're not being standardized. That means that we can't really have the insights that we could have and the digital technologies would allow us to have. So standardizing what we actually measure is the first very important step in order to make sure that we drive science where it can take us, but we can also allocate resources within healthcare much more efficiently than we currently do. So the standardization of the outcomes is the first thing, and a very important parameter to get it right is to do the standardization together with the patients, because we need to measure what matters to patients. But we also need to measure not only what matters to patients, but also how we will help the patients do the measurement. Because in order to be able to get the data that we need to make sure that the patients use the tools, stick to the tools, and do this consistently. And to do that, we need to design these tools together with the patients so that the patients see direct value, immediate value, and therefore help us and work with us in order to create the data sets that will help us achieve all the objectives that we discussed about driving science and achieving better healthcare.
So when you're a patient, you're in this role, and you're unfortunately sick or ill with whatever conditions, and you go to see your healthcare provider. It could be your primary care practitioner, it could be at a hospital, clinic, whatever, having diagnostics, all sorts of things. All of this is recorded, formerly recorded in vast volumes of paper notes in most healthcare systems, and sadly still quite a few still today, but increasingly in digital records. So this is data, this is contained in electronic systems and so forth. Challenge, of course, is that we are dealing with healthcare systems that have multiple different data capture, electronic health records and other systems and so forth to do that. So they have different machine languages, if you like, to contain this, with different human languages, of course, between different countries and so on as well. So you have all these challenges to begin with. How the data is collected over time may change as well. It's coded in various different coding systems, and they will vary nationally and internationally and so on. It's all a bit of a mess, to be honest. So out of this huge mess, we're trying to make some understanding, gain some further insights. And individual data, so for instance, my own record is of little use from a research point of view, unless I had incredibly rare disease, maybe. But actually, if you had my record linked with thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions or more of other records of people with similar or same disease over a long period of time, maybe, I could start to look for kind of like signals or signs or trends, for instance, you know, how the disease progresses. What particular aspects do we see in different types of people progressing to different types of disease outcomes and so on as well? What happened, for instance, if we got treated? What were all the different types of outcomes, and you know, how well did it work, and were there any adverse events and safety issues and side effects and so on? Increasingly, you know, down to the genetic or molecular level, are there particular targets that we can find to create new drugs, new therapeutics, new interventions, or indeed test out new devices, for instance, or diagnostics? So you can't do that. The innovation in healthcare would collapse if you're not able to look at this type of data. And although everyone focuses on the risks of doing that, of course, and, you know, privacy concerns, confidentiality and security and so forth, you actually have to weigh that up with the benefits. But also we need to do that in a very timely manner. And we can't wait anymore for, you know, years to go by before we can discover these things. So there are a number of things we need to do, and one of them is, as many were outlining, was standardizing data. So where it is in different machine languages, different human languages, different systems, can we either make it easier for everything to talk to each other, if you like, that's called interoperability, or can you standardize that data, maybe in a big database, or preferably actually where it is protected locally behind its, you know, firewalls and governance approval systems and so on, but create an overarching network of data where the data is structured very similarly, and then you can use very standardized tools on top of that to do analysis. If you have to do it the old way, which we do now, and analyze different types of data, you spend 80% of your time cleaning that data, what we call curating, but making the data available to answer your questions with your analysis per study, not overall, but every study, every question, every research. So standardize the data first, put standardized tools on top to analyze it, and then ask as many questions as you want, as you can, for that data that it can provide. So it's a critical step actually in standardizing, in terms of standardizing data and ensuring that we can start to use a lot of this data at scale. And without it, as I say, healthcare innovation and new drug discovery and our ability to manage diseases going forward in the future would seriously be damaged.
Thanks, Nigel. I mean, it seems so simple, doesn't it, in terms of why haven't we all come to this conclusion and be working together? But of course, you touched on many of the reasons why it's so complex in terms of how data sources speak to each other, how humans speak to each other, and in what language. So yeah, there's a lot there that we can explore. And Sarah, I suppose with Pioneer, what we have is a case study in a specific disease area, which is helpful as an example for how we might be able to do this on a broader scale across all health areas. So perhaps I'll just come to you next to talk about what you've seen in terms of benefits for patients by taking this big data approach.
The advantage of linking these data sets is quite incredible, quite immense, but it's a big task. From our organisation, it was driven through our clinical guidelines office. They recognised that there was no shortage of data out there, no shortage of research in a sense, but it wasn't providing the stuff that we needed to make really decent choices about the most effective way of caring for patients and bringing the best outcomes for them. It was just a lot of it is just not useful for us. So the idea of putting the hard graft in, as has just been explained, and trying to get those in a manageable way that we can look at large amounts of, in our case, men, and see where they live, where they work, where they play, what they do in their lives, it helps us to be more personalised, more clearer and more defined on particular groups or individuals even who may benefit from some treatments or some courses of care that others may not benefit from. So it helps us to really drill down on what's important.
None of you, of course, are patient group representatives on this particular coffee morning session, but you do all work with patient groups as part of these projects. So how important has that been, working with patients, advocates themselves, or patient group representatives, to ensure that these projects do have that long-term success and achieve on their objectives?
I think you can't do these projects without that, to be honest. They could be very kind of technical projects, you know, working with data and doing sexy stuff with analysis and putting all sorts of interesting technology in and so forth. But at the end of the day, this is all about people. It's all about us. It's all about patients, citizens and so forth. It's all about our healthcare, which is incredibly sensitive to us. It's not like going to buy a new refrigerator or a car or something, or going on holiday or something. You know, these things we do all the time. Well, sorry, the last one maybe not in the middle of the pandemic, but certainly in terms of healthcare, it's incredibly private to us as individuals. Even sometimes your own family and friends may not even recognise or realise that you have, you know, health issues and so on. Maybe your healthcare practitioners, you know, your GP or primary care practitioner or your hospital specialist or whoever you're seeing, maybe know more about this than other people around you. So what's really important is trust, for a start. But trust is actually based on trustworthiness. You know, it's actually an active process. You have to prove you're trustworthy. You can't just assume you can be trusted. And also that's really dependent on reliance. Can you rely on systems and governance and approval processes and consent and permissions? Lots of stuff we do in healthcare is based on permissions, actually not consent. When I give blood, that blood sample goes to a pathology lab, for instance, and it goes off with some details about me and why the blood test has been taken and to help them interpret the result. If I didn't consent to that, if I had to consent to everything that's done, you couldn't get anything done. So it's done a lot with clearly kind of implicit or closed permissions. And so we have to respond to that when we're talking about using this type of data that's taken from all these electronic health records, health outcomes and patient-reported outcomes, and, you know, wearables, all sorts of things are going forward these days and into the future. And therefore, one of the key things is transparency. You know, can you ensure there's not some black box you can't see what's going on inside, and have people who are deeply concerned about this, i.e. us, patients and so forth, have they been involved from the start? So we're very pleased the European Patients Forum is actually a partner of the consortium. There's 22 partners in Eden, and one of them is European Patients Forum. So they're in the project, and we have input from patient representatives. It's not, you know, it's not the whole patient population. It's very difficult, and obviously, you know, individuals can't necessarily represent everybody, but it's a start. But we have them, you know, we have colleagues, you know, who are patients, helping us on the development of things like our code of conduct, for instance, and our governance framework and so on. Communications, you know, we're working with European Patient Forum soon to launch a new course on the Eden Academy for people who are not technically minded, maybe patients, patient groups and citizens and others, to understand real world data and all these kind of things we're talking about and all these terminologies. So we have to be really very transparent about what we're doing, and that needs to start from and not be an afterthought after the end of the project.
I fully agree with what Nigel has said. There is one additional element, however, which is that, which I mentioned also a little bit when I first started speaking, which is if we want to be successful, then we need to make sure that patients use what we offer, right? We will not be able to measure the outcomes if patients don't use the tools that we give them in order to measure the outcomes. How can we ever design tools that patients will use if we don't ask them and we don't involve them very, very much from the beginning? And so working very closely with the patient organizations in order to ensure we design the right type of tools that patients will really like and will really find useful is fundamental. We can't do it without it. So it's not trust very important, but also the actual work that we are doing, we have to work with the patients.
And I'm really interested, Meni, for a project like H2O where the patient isn't defined by a specific condition, who are you looking for to involve in that? Because obviously with Sarah and Pioneer, there's a specific profile in mind of men living with prostate cancer, but when we're talking about patients generally, is that all of us? I mean, we all will be patients at one point in our life, but how to create that engagement?
It was actually very critical for us to partner with EPF because we do want to have this overall representation of the patients. Now, in order to be able to become practical, the way it actually works is that EPF, not us, EPF, has gone out to create 3 different patient advisory boards in the 3 specific disease areas where we will be focusing on to start with. But they know where to go and whom to find and how to deal with them, right? We could never do this credibly. So EPF is coordinating the approach, but then there are patient experts, if you will, who will be joining these patient advisory boards that will help us achieve our objectives.
Same goes for the other projects that we, obviously you can't start building trust or even building in opinions of patients without having them as, I guess, equal partners in the consortium. So I think that's been really important. They play really important part in each and every sort of consensus meeting and in all the project outcomes. And for us, very importantly, patient representatives influence the kind of research questions that we're going to be asking and prioritising. And I'll probably come into a bit more detail about that in later questions, but they really give us a very guiding role in what research we should be focusing on now that we've gathered some large quantities of data together in a platform, both federated and centralized, that can be used for research. Now, what do we do with that? What research are we going to be focusing on? Well, that patients are really playing quite a lead role in making those decisions for and with us.
I just want to talk up Pioneer as well, Sarah, because so recently, a few weeks ago, there was what's called a study-a-thon that Pioneer led, and Eden and other colleagues from an international collaboration called Odyssey were involved in. And study-a-thon is basically like shortening large-scale research studies into literally days, so like a week. You do a lot of preparatory work to do that, but then you do all the kind of work you would normally take you months to do in 5 days. And this one was looking at evaluating what were the real world outcomes from men who had prostate cancer, who were having actually no treatment, but something called watchful waiting, just seeing how they progress, because they may actually not even need treatment. That's from guidelines, but actually what happens in the real world to real, men, patients with prostate cancer. One of the really fantastic things about that study-a-thon, and there's been a number of them to date, but this was one of the first, I think, where Pioneer included men who have been treated or have prostate cancer during those 5 days, and they spent time not just telling their story, for instance, and informing people how important all this was, which is quite often what you hear, but actually influencing the kind of research questions, as Sarah was saying, during the study. It's highly unusual, and I think this really is a fantastic example of what could happen in the future in terms of much more partnership between researchers and what researchers can often call subjects, but actually patients, real people, in directing what research is done and how it's conducted, and also more importantly, and I suppose many could speak to this too, what's important for patients in terms of what research is conducted and what's important for them versus what researchers necessarily think is important too.
It's critical that not only research, but also the way value healthcare is designed is really focusing on what patients need most. In the H2O, we look at research, of course, but we also look at the actual healthcare delivery, right? That's an important objective for us. And I think it's equally important there that we focus on what patients really need and not on what doctors or others think that would be good for patients.
Yeah, in terms of what we've been discussing, patient groups are potentially finding them having to adopt a new role, a kind of new take in terms of inputting into these initiatives. What do you think is the impact for patient groups who might be a little afraid this is outside of their remit? They've usually just been supporting community members, but is the onus on them now to step up and get involved?
Absolutely. So this creates a completely new world for patient groups. And I can see their role mainly in 2 areas being really, really important. The first is to help all of us understand what really matters to patients in order to come up with measurements, what we often call in our jargon, the patient-reported outcomes, right? We call them PROs, and that term may come up again in the discussion, but to help us design the type of PROs and the ways to measure these PROs that will be really relevant and really easy for patients to measure, right? So this design of the PROs is an area where we can only do it with the active participation of the patient groups. Then the second area where it's a completely new world for the patient groups will be in the analysis of the outcomes, right? Because we will be having some outcomes through these exercises that will give us a much better understanding of what's happening with the disease at a population level, which means that patient groups can now do what they've always been doing, which is advocacy, but in a completely different way, evidence-based advocacy, right? Which means that they can be much more effective, they can be much more insightful, and they can serve their community much better, which may also mean that they might need to develop some additional capabilities to what they already have, since there's so much bigger potential for what they're doing. I think it's this whole digitization of outcomes is going to be very good news for patient groups.
Tanya, welcome. Thank you for joining the panel. Just like any coffee morning, we've had another addition drop into our virtual cafe, as it were. So would you be able to introduce yourself to our audience and what your involvement is in the projects?
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me to the session. My name is Tanya Stamm from the Medical University of Vienna, and I'm a professor for outcomes research, and we are coordinating the H2O project.
Brilliant. Thank you, Tanya. How can the input of data into health outcome studies promote a richer discussion between patients and healthcare providers?
Yes, I think that's a very important question, and I think that especially patients, and we have been doing research in that area for years, yeah? Especially patients would benefit very much from the use or the advanced models of how health data could be used. And one of these areas, I think, is the individual clinical situation where data could be used by the patients themselves, for example, in terms of self-management, or what you could really, that you could see how your disease has been or symptoms have been in the recent days or weeks or months, but also in terms of improving the communication with the clinician, because I think, and especially of course, and in the H2O, the Health Outcomes Observatory project, we are very much interested in patient-reported outcomes in relation to clinical outcomes. And I think especially with regard to what is important to the patients in everyday life, it's also very important to see how this has been. So to make something smart or intelligent of the data that are captured by the patients themselves. I think that's one of our main issues also in the H2O project. And that could very much not only improve the self-management, but also the communication with the clinician. And apart from this individual perspective, I think that especially patient groups or patient organizations could benefit from data in terms of advocacy, so they can actually use the data in order to come up with some advocacy activities, or also maybe messages to the audience, to general public, but also to regulators, to healthcare providers. And I think then, of course, it's very important to have some advanced insights in how patients are doing, for example, in different countries or different regions, so that you can really compare yourself with a reference population, yeah, not only in the individual situation, but also in terms of using the data for more advocacy activities. So I think it's really important, and I think it links very nicely to the initiative Data Saves Lives, because that's some of the or one of the main things that we would like to see also in the H2O project, so that it would really be of a benefit for patients.
Thanks, Tanya. And I suppose a lot of the discussion that we've had today as a group has been around looking towards the future and what the standardization of data can bring, how making health data more accessible to citizens and patients can have long-term benefits for the individual, as you just said, but also for wider society. It can feel fairly intangible, but we've actually achieved a lot from where we are. So what I'd love to do is ask each member here on the panel to share what's been their proudest achievement in terms of the projects that they've been coordinating.
The consortium that we've created is probably the proudest achievement so far. I think there's more going forward, but to start with, getting together such a great team of both institutions and individuals, I think is the best possible thing we could have done in order to be able to deliver on the projects. And it's not just it's great people and it's great organizations, but it's also who they are. So partnering with the European Patient Forum was a critical requirement to make this project successful. Bringing in top academic medical institutions who are brave enough themselves to say that they really want to focus in patient-reported outcomes, in standardizing, measuring, collecting patient-reported outcomes, and agreeing that we should have this data managed independently, and embracing this concept, which is very, very strong in our philosophy, that health data needs to be seen as an essential resource, that it is becoming really available to the society in the interest of the society, but at the same time, for as long, of course, as the individual patient has consented, there's no doubt about that. But if the patient has consented and we have a patient data set, then this needs to be available to any bona fide researcher. So having these institutions agreeing to that and embracing to that, I think to me was probably the proudest moment so far, but I'm also pretty sure there will be a lot of proud moments to come in the future.
Thanks, Melly.
We're now 3 years into the project, and I think there's been that the first 3 years have been really important, and you know, they are an achievement in themselves. It's where the sort of the foundations have been laid, and a lot of the nuts and bolts of working out the centralized data system and the federated platform and all the, you know, all the technical stuff and all the GDPR compliance and what kind of data we're using, and more or less we are using anonymized data for our project. But so we've got there, and then this year in March we were able to conduct this study-a-thon. So we're, as Nigel was saying, basically a very intensive study period, and it involved 200 researchers, but also patient representatives over this 5-day period. And basically people were working 24 hours a day, because when one team, you know, when the team in Europe went to bed, another team were just getting up and starting and looking on the data. And it was, you know, it was really very exciting that patients were also joining throughout that five days and had played a role in deciding what we would be, the research questions we were going to be looking at anyway. We used anonymous data sets from 1.4 million patients. Researchers were bringing along their anonymized data sets, even though that they weren't part of the platform itself, because they wanted to be involved in the research and in finding out more about this particular phase of treatment of prostate care. And so now I think we're just getting to the point of being able to see some really tangible outcomes. So we've got the data, we can actually start linking it up even with further data sets if they've also been standardized, and we can now be answering these research questions with patients and for patients on things that really matter to them about their actual care, and I think that's really exciting, and it sped up that whole process from what would normally take, months and months, if not years, condensed it into a 5-day period, basically. Exciting.
A huge achievement, and amazing to see the kind of momentum that over 3 years you've grown and culminated into so many people. It shows how great an appetite there is to be involved in these kind of projects and actually make the data work for everyone. Nige, can I ask you what your proudest moment for Eden is?
Yes, it's difficult actually. One doesn't want to brag and say there are more than one moment, but I'll be very naughty and cheat and say two. One quickly is the creation of the Eden Academy, which is a free online educational resource for anyone who wants to gain better skills and understanding of tools and methods in working with real world data and handling data and standardizing it and so forth. But importantly, the fact that we'll launch this lay course, is the word, this public course for patients and citizens and patient groups soon with the European Patients Forum. And also, I think via research study-a-thons last year with our Odyssey colleagues, I think the impact in terms of addressing a number of key questions in the COVID-19 pandemic. So we're being readily able to show, and we're only about halfway through the project, that we can already start to use the principle of what we're doing and working with standardizing data and creating these so-called federated networks where data stays local and is protected, but also to create evidence when we need it most. Pandemic, arguably, that's a good example. So this only, I think, bodes well for every other disease, beyond COVID-19 in the future.
I think that's hugely positive, and as you say, the pandemic has brought a lot of what we've been discussing today to the public front of consciousness, and I hope that continues. We're now just about to wrap up our coffee morning, so thank you so much to all our panelists for being involved. If you as an audience member have enjoyed this particular format, then please do comment below, and if there are particular topics that you'd like us to explore with future panelists, then please do also comment. I think it's safe to say, from a curiosity perspective from our side, that we'd certainly want to catch up with you all to see where we are in the coming months from now, because you really are all at that point where we're about to see some great outcomes and outputs from these conversations and these initiatives. So thank you very much for taking part.